slightly confused with it, what we'll do is use that information going through the standardized documents. Hopefully could provide some clarity around how the suppliers want the information presented. So if we just recap from a guidance perspective, this is lifted from Ofgem's supply guidance. Percentage of property treated. So the Ofgem Dean scores assume that the measure type that's being installed treats 100% of that property. So for example, cavity wall insulation, the Dean score assumes that all heat loss walls of that property are of cavity construction, and importantly, it assumes that the 100% of those walls are being insulated. If they're not being insulated, then your POP reduces, and that is the percentage which affects your carbon or your LTS score. The actual percentage is rounded to the nearest 10%. Because that POP calculation is what affects the carbon score or the LTS score, you can imagine that's where a lot of the focus is in respect of energy supply checks and also technical monitoring, because that percentage is going to be part of the new technical monitoring questions which are used when agents go to site. In terms of POMI, percentage of measure installed, what that's basically asking is the total area that the measure could be installed to. So how much have you done that of that compared to the actual overall available measure. So that's just trying to make sure that you're not omitting areas, for example, for something such as cost. So let's have a look at a example here. So let's assume that the original building was this square box here, and the customer's had a new build extension built here on the left hand side, so it's going to have been insulated as part of building regulations. So in this scenario, your heat loss walls for this property, this wall here, this wall, but because let's assume that this is a heated extension, because that is a heated extension, your heat loss wall is now extended to the outer skin of this building. So they are your heat loss walls, and let's assume that the back is fairly standard, there's no conservatories, etc. on the back. You can also see from this property that you've got a tile hung area here. So clearly from a technical perspective, we know that that bit's going to need to be part of our calculations when we're looking at how much of the property we've actually treated. We're not interested in the garage because let's assume that the garage is going to be unheated, therefore that remains your heat loss wall. So let's look at an example of a technical survey. I wouldn't worry too much about the actual dimensions, it's just here to illustrate the point of what information the suppliers are going to want. We're also not looking at photographs as part of this video, we're just looking at the actual evidence on the core documents. So you can see on this technical survey, what we've done is we've clearly shown on this front elevation here the dimensions of the property. We've basically highlighted here the tile hung area, and we've grayed that out because that's showing from an evidence perspective that you've omitted that area because it's tile hung, and that can be verified by the photographs that you're providing. And also we're assuming that this is a new build extension, so we've measured it, but we've grayed that out because we're saying that's also going to be omitted. And then you've got the same principle for the rest of the property, but we're assuming that for the purpose of this, the only emissions are the extension and that tile hung area, and the rest of the property is fairly straightforward. So once you've got all of those dimensions, you will then be able to, on your technical survey form, deducting the areas for windows, start to build a picture of what is the total heat loss wall of the front, left, right and rear side, and the area of the actual extension minus the windows. So we've got a main building that has a total heat loss wall area of 63 metres squared, and we've got an extension which has an area of 14 metres squared. So on your Dean score survey sheet, we've got the property sections down the left hand side. So what you wouldn't do on this form is you wouldn't start splitting out in these rows the tile hung areas. We're basically talking about the main property and the extension looked at on an individual basis. So if there wasn't any extensions on this property, you would only ever have one line for the main building. We've basically said that both of those properties are of cavity wall construction. We're saying here the total heat loss wall, excluding windows, is 63 square metres for the main building, 14 square metres for the extension. So we've got a total heat loss wall area for that property of 77 square metres. What we're saying here, this is now asking you what you're going to install. So for the main property, we've got 63 square metres, and we're saying we're going to install 61 square metres. So if we look back at the technical survey, the supplier can pick that up and say, well, okay, I can see that on the main building there is a tile hung area that's 2 metres squared, and that's the reason why on this Dean score survey there's a difference of 2 metres. We're saying we can't insulate that tile hung area, so we're only going to insulate 61 square metres. On the extension, we've got an area of 14 square metres, but because it's new build and it's already insulated, we're not going to install any of it. So we then end up with this figure here, which is in box B, which says of the 77 metres squared of that heat loss wall, we are insulating 61 square metres. What you then do is on this box here, we actually calculate the accurate popped calculation. So 61 divided by 77 equals 79%, and then we round up here to the nearest 10%. So the suppliers want to see the actual percentage there and then the rounded percentage there. And actually this figure here is going to become one of the reporting fields that's going to be introduced over the coming weeks and months, because the suppliers want to start seeing that. Moving on to the Dean score survey sheet itself, just for completeness, what we've got here is a floor plan, again with the dimensions on. We've got the location of the heating system. You've clearly marked up where the extension is, and you've marked up where the bedrooms are in that particular property. Then moving on to the declaration of conformity. So once we've got our Dean score survey form, we're then looking at transferring that information onto the doc. So this is all fairly standard. You select your variant for the material that's been used. You insert the actual product that's been used alongside the BBA certificate number. This is your popped calculation, but it's the rounded percentage. So we went through before that was 79%, but it's rounded to 80. So that's the figure that goes in that box there, and importantly, that's the figure that also goes in the popped part of the property hub, because we need to actually reduce that Dean score by 20%, because in this instance we're only going to claim 80% of the Dean score. However, from a POMI perspective, you've insulated 100% of the available measure, because you can't do the tile hung area because it's technically unsuitable, and you haven't done the extension because it's actually already insulated. So that situation there, you've got 100% POMI but 80% popped. That's the key figure, the 80%. Hopefully you found that useful in terms of clarifying how all of that information goes on to the Dean score survey and other documents.